It's happening, but why? I mean, it's crazy that we're talking about stacking a rocket that's going to launch potentially 18 months from now. I mean, really?
Yeah, I know. That's why I'm like, this seems kind of
I
weird.
mean, that's how it might have worked 50 years ago, but this is the year 2024, you know?
We do not fly until we are ready. We do not fly until we are confident that we have made the flight as safe as possible for the humans on board.
Well, we got a little update on our return to the moon, and according to Bill Nelson, we're likely going to beat China, but apparently we're not going to see the moon landing attempt until at least mid-2027, and we won't see Artemis 2, which is the flyby with crew, until April of 2026. So yes, there have been a ton of shakeups recently and announcements within NASA, including the fact that Jared Isaacman will now be the head of NASA thanks to President Trump. But Bill Nelson gave an update on Artemis, and we learned that they are going to keep the Artemis 2 plan as is. But they were having problems with Orion's heat shield, so what they're going to do to solve that issue is modifying the re-entry trajectory to address concerns with that heat shield. So I wanted to talk to Eric Berger about this. He is a space industry expert, and he says that it's good that NASA finally confirmed Artemis 2 won't happen next year, but he says what they won't say today, but he thinks is a very real possibility, is that Artemis 2 won't fly on the SLS rocket either. What do you think about the update and sort of the resolution with the heat shield issue?
Well, it's nothing we haven't been reporting for months. Both my colleague and I, Stephen Clark, have been talking for quite a while that NASA was expected to stay with the Orion heat shield as is and fly a different reentry profile, thinking that that is likely to solve the problem. And that as a result of this, the next mission, Artemis 2, was going to slip into 2026. So there really were no surprises. The only really new thing was the technical detail about some of the heat shield issues. It was nice to finally get that. I mean, it's been 2 years since Artemis 1. And so, this has been a very slow process, and it's been a very non-transparent process for the public. And so it was good to finally get a little bit of insight into what the NASA officials have been studying today. Bigger picture, I don't think it means a whole lot because the incoming administration is going to look at all of this stuff and probably make some significant changes to the plans laid out by NASA.
I was going to say, because I've seen, all over X that, and you've even said that the odds now are even greater that you think that it just might be canceled entirely. So do you stand by that?
So I don't think the Artemis program is going to be canceled. I think that the main thrust is going to be sending humans to the moon and then eventually onto Mars. I do think the way that it happens could very well change. A lot of several of the sources that I talked to suggesting that the Space Launch System rocket is likely to be canceled. I mean, let's face it, it's been a boondoggle in terms of costs. It did have a very good first flight back in 2022, but the reality is that, in this year, we should not be spending, $2 billion when you add in ground systems, $2.5 or $3 billion for the launch of a single expendable rocket. That's nonsense. And I think there are lots of people in and out of government who recognize that for a long time, but the Trump administration, I think, is going to push through to finally sort of kick that ant's nest over, or hornet's nest, and make the change to cancel the SLS rocket. It's not a done deal, but I think that's likely where we're headed. And so you're going to see some commercial rockets used, to take care of Orion and the Artemis 2 and possibly Artemis 3 missions.
So you think Orion will still be in the picture?
It's in the trade space. I think it's unclear to me exactly what's going to happen. But Orion is viewed as more important to at least consider keeping than the SLS rocket. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of seems like everything that we heard today from Bill Nelson, that just might not be how things play out once the new administration comes in, and maybe for good reason.
I mean, as one person described it to me, there's a lot of people up there talking about things that are not going to happen. So, it was.
It's what it felt like.
I remember back 4 years ago, there was the final Space Council meeting. and Vice President Mike Pence kind of wanted to have a splash. They created this Artemis cadre of astronauts saying, these are the people that are going to the moon, right? And that always felt really silly to me because, first of all, we were years away from even picking a crew of astronauts to go to the land on the moon. And secondly, it really created these divisions within the astronaut office because you had like the chosen, right? And then the people who were outside the spotlight didn't get named. How do you think that made them feel? And so it just kind of felt like they were talking about things that weren't going to happen. In this case, it was the same kind of thing. Like all of this. I mean, and look, Artemis 2 and Artemis 3 may fly with the current architecture as planned. Your Gateway may get built and put into near rectilinear halo orbit. I'm just saying that I would bet against that at this point. Like I said, like the people who will ultimately make these decisions are not in power yet. But those are the discussions that are being had right now.
Someone was saying too, the fact that they have it stacked right now and upright, but they're not going to be flying it for a year and a half. Is that kind of strange?
I mean, I think that they want to move forward and show that they're making progress toward launch. And so you do that by assembling the rocket and then taking pictures of it and saying, hey, look, we've got this booster ready to go, and then you could turn around and destack it at some point if you need to. So, the fact that they're doing that, they don't need to be doing it, frankly, and they're introducing a little bit of risk because the boosters have some kind of shelf life on them that they're going to have to extend in the stacked configuration. So, it's happening, but why? I mean, it's crazy that we're talking about stacking a rocket that's going to launch potentially 18 months from now. I mean, really?
Yeah, I know. That's why I'm like, this seems kind of weird.
I mean, that's how it might have worked 50 years ago, but this is the year 2024,
There is so much going on in the space world. It can be hard to keep up. And as a journalist, you have to have good sources, but we know the internet is full of bad actors. The best tool that I've discovered to verify sources of information and get all sides of any story is from today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is an app and website that gathers news articles from more than 50,000 sources from around the world in one place, so you can compare how different outlets cover the same story. And it was actually founded by a former NASA engineer who saw the need for more transparency in media coverage. As a former TV news reporter and anchor myself, I think this tool is invaluable because it arms you with the knowledge to become a smarter news consumer. So follow along ground.news/Ellie. For an example, let's look at this article, Mysterious Odor from Russian Spacecraft Prompts ISS Precautions. Comparing coverage side by side, we can see that it's been covered by over 60 news sources, with the majority coming from center-leaning publications. We can also see that collectively 79% of those are rated as highly factual. Taking a closer look at the headlines, we can see that the left employs alarmist language such as foul stench and suggests urgency with immediately close the Poise catch, framing the incident as a potential crisis. The center critiques NASA's reassurances, emphasizing distrust and highlighting a history of Russian space issues, thus presenting a more skeptical tone toward government narratives. And it's well worth reading through how headlines differ on the same topic, even with something as simple as this story. It's a great tool in today's new age of misinformation and clickbait, making sure you get access to different viewpoints in one place so you can get the full story. Check them out at ground.news/Ellie and use my link to save 50% on the same Vantage plan that I use to get unlimited access to all their features. So let me read you more about the exact cause of the Artemis 1 Orion heat shield char loss. According to NASA, after extensive analysis and testing, the technical cause of unexpected char loss across the Orion spacecraft's heat shield has been determined. Engineers determined as Orion was returning from its uncrewed mission around the moon, gases generated inside the heat shield's ablative outer material called avcoat were not able to vent and dissipate as expected. This allowed pressure to build up and cracking to occur, causing some charred material to break off in several locations. And during Artemis 1, engineers used the skip guidance entry technique to return Orion to Earth. This technique provides more flexibility by extending the range Orion can fly after the point of re-entry to a landing spot in the Pacific Ocean. Using this maneuver, Orion dipped into the upper part of the Earth's atmosphere and used atmospheric drag to slow down. Orion then used the aerodynamic lift of the capsule to skip back out of the atmosphere, then re-enter for the final descent under parachutes to splashdown. But maybe this skip guidance entry technique wasn't so good, which is why they're going to change it for Artemis 2. They found this out during testing using AVCOAT material response data from Artemis 1. The investigation team was able to replicate the Artemis 1 entry trajectory environment, a key part of understanding the cause of the issue, inside the ARC jet facilities at NASA's Ames Research Center in California. So here's where it gets interesting. They observed that during the period between dips into the atmosphere, heating rates decreased and thermal energy accumulated inside the heat shield's AVCOAT material. This led to the accumulation of gases that are part of the expected ablation process. Because the AVCOAT did not have permeability, internal pressure built up and led to cracking and uneven shedding of the outer layer. And so this is where we learned during the press conference that NASA teams unanimously agreed the agency can develop acceptable flight rationale that will keep crew safe using the current Artemis 2 heat shield with operational changes to entry.
They think that theoretically that they've solved the issue with ground testing and so forth, and they probably have, but that's the thinking behind it.
Wow. I wonder if I'd be comfortable with theoreticals as the person going in that.
Well, astronauts are certainly very brave people. I mean, they're part of their job is to take risks, and if the engineers say that it's safe, then they'll climb on board the rocket.
But despite the press conference today and us hearing the new timeline and intended plan for Artemis, I really have to wonder if it's going to be the actual plan that we see executed with a new head of NASA coming in to direct NASA, Jared Isaacman, as well as the Trump administration, the Department of Government Efficiency, which we know NASA has had plenty of issues being efficient, especially when it comes to finances. So I kind of thought it was odd listening to the conference because I don't actually think that this is how things are going to play out. Will they keep Orion but ditch SLS? Of course, time will tell, but it sounds like it wouldn't be all that surprising and something that NASA should really lean into now that we have commercial space operators doing things better and cheaper than what government can do. So let's talk about, kind of what happened yesterday with the announcement about Jared Isaacman.
Yeah, it's a pretty big deal that the Trump administration put forward a nominee this early. The past couple go-rounds, it's been later that the process has gotten started, but they clearly want to make changes across a broad number of fronts, space included. So we got the commercial astronaut and entrepreneur Jared Isaacman as a nominee, and I think it's a pretty inspiring choice because this is someone who understands where spaceflight is headed, has experience flying into space a couple times very recently, and has seen how fast things can move when right incentives are applied. And so, yeah, I think it's a good pick for a 21st century administrator.
Were you surprised by his pick?
So I heard about a week ago that it was possible. At that time, I was surprised. But I wasn't super surprised when the announcement actually came yesterday. There had been some other names percolating around, but it makes sense, when you look at it and all the different possibilities. And frankly, for the spaceflight community, it would be hard to do better because this is someone who's really passionate about a lot of the things that we're all passionate about. And so he's going to get a chance to work on NASA to try to bring them, modernize them.
He certainly doesn't need to do this. As you were pointing out in your article, he's, a billionaire, self-funded 2 space missions at this point. So why do you think that he agreed? I mean, it's one thing to be offered it. It's another thing to agree.
Yeah. I mean, it's if he does it for 4 years, it's 4 years of hard work. I mean, you're traveling a lot, he's got young kids, he's got a family. And it's a lot of meetings with a lot of different people, and everyone's coming at you with different interests. And it's working within a bureaucracy. I mean, it's not an easy job. It's a hard job, especially if you really want to make significant changes, which I think he does. But the reality is, in the conversations I've had with Jared over the years, he's always made it pretty clear that he wants to make a difference. He wants to make a positive difference. He believes that, we're in the beginnings of this commercial space revolution. And if we do things right, humans in space can really take off. So I think he's doing it because he feels like he can make a difference. And this is a position from which to do that.
I thought it was interesting that Bill Nelson did want to point out that, hey, even though it's slipping until mid-2027, we still should beat China. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think 3 years ago I wrote an article that basically said the earliest date for Artemis 3 with this plan is 2028. So, I mean, it could slip to 2027. They're not on schedule to meet 2027 right now. That may change with new plans and new energy and different funding. We'll see. I take all those dates with a huge grain of salt.
It's important in an area where we think there is such promise, the South Pole, primarily because of the presence of water, that we establish our presence there so that China would not be there and say, keep out. Now, why do I say that? Well, you can usually tell about where a fellow's going by virtue of where he's been. And the history, the political history, the defense history of China, we have seen what they've done in the South China Sea with the Spratly Islands, most recently taking a sand spit of an island that is within the 200-mile range of the Philippines and suddenly claiming that's not the Philippines, that's China's territory, building it into a runway for military and a harbor for military. And so I wish it weren't that way. I wish that China could be someone that we could cooperate with, and maybe there will be an opportunity in the future. I hope so. But given the fact of the history of how the Chinese government has operated up until including recently, I don't want that to occur on a very important part of the moon.
Yeah, it still just kind of feels like even mid-2027 is like, why has this taken so long?
Well, I mean, it is a really complicated endeavor, right? The architecture involves lots of different rockets launching. You've got a lot of work to do with Starship because, it's flying great right now, but it's got to show it can land on the moon. That's not easy. It's got to show it can take off from the moon. That's not easy with a liquid fueled rocket. And that's even that you've got to get past orbital refueling to get to that point. I mean, so it's like everyone's got a lot of work to do still to make this happen.
Right. And it's totally, different than what we did before.
Right. I mean, it's different from the Apollo mission, which was really, the grand scheme of things, a pretty straightforward approach, right? It was a single stack mission. Everything was on top of the Saturn V. You had the lunar module that flew away, and then eventually only the tiny Apollo capsule came back to Earth, and those were put in museums. And so none of it was reused, and it was basically the bare minimum to put humans safely down on the moon for a couple of days and bring them back to Earth. That was completely non-sustainable, and that's why Apollo was ultimately canceled, because it was really expensive, and there was a limited amount you could do with that architecture.
Do you think that with Jared heading NASA, we're going to see this unbelievable change that everyone's anticipating, or do you think that it'll be harder than, maybe we think?
Oh, it's going to be very hard. I mean, NASA is let me do the math, 60-year-old agency, lots of entrenched bureaucracies. Within the agency, you have 10 field centers. Each of those have their own competing priorities. And they may not all be rowing in the same direction. Each of those centers has people in Congress who look out for their interests like a hawk. And so if you take $1 from a center for some reason, you've got to give it back for another reason. So it's going to be it's a very difficult environment to navigate. But, if he brings in his own people and pushes hard, I think he can make meaningful change over time.
And so looking ahead, I mean, we still have Butch and Sunny coming home in February. Is there anything else that you're just is really on your radar right now?
Oh, there's lots of things. I think to certainly be very excited about the prospect of a New Glenn launch within the month or two to see that rocket take flight. It's a super impressive vehicle. If you've seen it up close, it's going to be great to watch. And then they're going to try to land it at sea. It would be great to have a second vertically landed company making a second rocket that can be vertically landed. I mean, that clearly is the future. And then, you've got the next Starship test with a new version of that vehicle, which will be exciting. You've got Vulcan missions. There's lots of great stuff coming in the next year or so. They just won't be Artemis.
Yeah. Do you like, you proposed or talked about a potential swap if we don't have SLS using, Centaur. Do you like that version?
Yeah. I mean, this has been the idea for almost 20 years that use commercial launch vehicles with just called distributed launch. You don't spend $3 billion for a single rocket. Why is NASA building it when commercial companies are? I mean, it's just, people have been advocating this for 20 years. And now it's increasingly hard to ignore when you have Vulcan and Falcon Heavy and Starship and soon to be New Glenn. I mean, you have commercial heavy lift is here, it's flying. And so what are we doing?
So why ignore the common sense? Is it just to protect jobs?
I mean, there's a huge congressional constituency behind the Space Launch System rocket, has protected it for years. The Alabama delegation didn't want to give it up, doesn't want to give it up, and will fight it tooth and nail. And plus you have Boeing like fighting, alongside, but the sands have shifted, right? Boeing has had really trouble. It has not executed on its spaceflight programs. We've seen that quite clearly. And meantime, new space has continued to rise. And so I think now is the time to probably push for this change, and we'll see that happens, and we'll see ultimately what does happen.
So thanks so much for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed hearing Eric's insights, and thank you to him as always for doing an interview with me. I think that we have a lot to be excited for next year, which is approaching pretty quickly, and wow, already so many changes. We're going to have another Starship flight likely in January. We look forward to the return of Butch and Sunny in February, and of course, what's going to happen with the incoming administration and many changes to NASA on the way.